I'm Earl Johnson Jr., son of Earl Johnson, one of the original consolidators, secretary to the Consolidation Commission.
And an important part of the history of consolidation, needless to say, your dad.
Well, he played a few integral roles, probably three that I could identify. He was one of the leading blacks in Jacksonville, the old city, by the mid 1960s. He had represented Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy. He had filed nearly all of the school desegregation cases in the state of Florida. He was the first black member of the Jacksonville Bar Association. I think he was admitted in 1958. And so at the time, both black and white leaders alike felt that as the black electorate grew with white flight, and that tipping point was expected as early as 1967, that my father might well be the first black mayor of Jacksonville, might become mayor of Jacksonville in 1967. Now, that certainly fancied him to an extent, but ultimately he had to make a decision about whether or not he was going to either work to maintain the status quo of Jacksonville, which at the time was really not in a great place. I mean, over 11 officials, elected officials, were indicted with over 140 counts of fraud and bribery. The school system had been disaccredited. Raw sewage was being pumped into our pristine river on a daily basis. And then, of course, with white flight, with the movement of whites out of the old core city into other areas of the county, came the overall lessening or decreasing of the population and decreasing of the tax coffers for the old city. So, while the idea of becoming mayor of Jacksonville, old city Jacksonville, was interesting, ultimately my father would say, who wants to be mayor of a bankrupt town? And ultimately, the good of the entirety of the population of this area was of great importance to him. And so, keeping in mind this was 1965, 66, there were other things happening in the world, including my father's efforts with civil rights and MLK. There was an idea that as blacks moved and traveling was an issue with Jim Crow and segregation. So there was always a fear about traveling from one jurisdiction to another. And in Jacksonville, of course, at the time, there was a duplicative governments in every way. There was a city mayor, a county commission, a city police department, a county sheriff's office, dual roles in almost every level. And so blacks had the idea that creating an overall city government which reached to the county, creating one jurisdiction, would provide a little more safety for black families, maybe more opportunity for black families. Certainly might address the issue of illegal housing segregation that existed in Jacksonville at the time. And so, but naturally, of course, there was strong and intelligent opposition to that kind of diluting of the black vote within the black community and black leadership. But overall, more blacks voted for consolidation. My dad joined the effort to consolidate Jacksonville, became a white hat, and was secretary to the Consolidation Commission. He challenged the commission in 1966 that the effort was, and the challenge was going to be not to only sell consolidation as the best hope for blacks in Jacksonville, but that ultimately it was the best hope for the entirety of our community. And I believe that to be true. It has not been, this experiment has not been a 100% success, of course, but ultimately the idea of streamlining city and county services so that there's a one-stop shop, if you will, in our county government, has created a much better school system, one that has produced at least 2 schools that are nationally recognized in the old core city. We've got a park system which is nationally recognized, making great efforts with the restoration of our river. And we have a strong mayor city council form of government which sets up certain checks and balances that just didn't exist previously. Certain promises, though, of where that newly found tax money by reaching every part of the county, certain promises about infrastructure needs in the old core city still have yet to be met, and that was the finding of the 2014 task force on the consolidation study. And so work to be done, to be sure, but ultimately I think we've come a long way. Now, my father went on to become an at-large member of the first consolidated council, so his civic effort didn't stop with the commission. He ultimately did run for elected office, was elected, served on the city council in the 60s, 70s, and 80s in Jacksonville citywide.
And an at-large council member is elected by the entire county.
Well, that's exactly right. The entire county elects the at-large council member. He was the first black elected county or citywide post-consolidation. For many years, Sheriff Glover was the next. And so we've come a long way, but I believe that if you're to grade us on consolidation and potentially the impact of consolidation on blacks in Jacksonville, I think you have to ask yourself a few things. Firstly, has it interrupted black citizens' involvement with our local government? I would say not hardly. Blacks have served at every level in Jacksonville's consolidated government, from mayor to sheriff. Today, as we sit here in 2018, I believe there are more city heads of agencies right now who are African American than ever before. And so there's been, obviously, as a result of the consolidation, it certainly diluted the black vote from maybe 50% to about 30% of the entirety of the county. But interestingly, the number of black people in Jacksonville has certainly increased since consolidation, but I think moreover, the percentage of blacks in our county overall has increased since consolidation. So I think there are pockets of economic development need. We still see certain food deserts in parts of our city, and there's work to be done.
Infrastructure needs.
Well, which are great. And let me say this about infrastructure needs. They're certainly not limited to the old core city. I grew up in Mandarin, and I can tell you that we were on septic and well. It continues on. And so there are areas of the old county, Mandarin, West Side, even South Side and the Inglewood area that remain without city water or sewage. So the promise needs to be made citywide.
So your dad made a very big decision about his political future. And I was wondering if, as far as you can recall, he ever had any regrets.
Well, you know, the decision that was made by him at the time to support consolidation was one of practicality, and that was my father. You know, he was an attorney. He certainly had an ideal of what our society should look like. He was an avid civil rights attorney. As I indicated, he represented Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy and Andy Young. Followed nearly all of the school desegregation cases in the state of Florida. but ultimately, he was a pragmatist, and the notion of being able to get rid of the waste and the bureaucracies of having two governments that didn't interact very well together, to streamline that into one government, with the Madisonian model of strong mayor, legislative, and the general counsel acting as the judiciary, if you will, was very, very interesting to him, and moreover, the ability to capture the tax dollars needed to make good on certain promises to areas in the city that needed the most was the overarching consideration over his personal interest in his political ambition.
And
But
we
yes.
need to give him a lot of credit for that.
Well, I appreciate that, and we in my family have heard the stories of consolidation from this perspective, at least, our entire lives around the dinner table. I was a poli-sci major at Florida State, and so I actually studied consolidation. Wrote a piece on consolidation as part of my senior paper. Drew a lot from Mr. Martin's Quiet Revolution, of course. Yes.
You pointed out something that a lot of people don't think about. The vote in August '67.
Yes.
Black and white voters approved of consolidation. And, I wonder now, is there a certain level of buyer's remorse, particularly among African Americans?
Well, as we move forward in our 50th year of this experimental government, I don't think the discussion has ever gone away. Whether you're black, white, living on Moncrief or on Sunbeam Road in Jacksonville, I think there's always been a question about whether that was the right move. I believe, personally, that it was the right move overall for the entirety of the city, but we are a long way from reaching the kind of government with the response to the areas that needed it the most. That was the biggest part of our promise of consolidation.
And we can only speculate about what Jacksonville would be like if we had said no on consolidation.
It's only speculative. There were certain models around the nation that we could potentially look to, whether that was Detroit, Atlanta, or other cities that ultimately did grow its black population and have, as a result, a lot of black leaders in the city. But ultimately, some of our big city issues, in my opinion, transcend race in terms of who's in charge. So you see the same kinds of problems in those cities that are, whether they have black administrations or white administrations. They still have issues of crime. They still have issues of economic development and blight in the urban city. And so, my humble opinion, ultimately the issue is about not black or white leadership, but effective leadership.
And I don't want to end this interview without giving you an opportunity to say something about your mother.
Well, my mom, Janet, wore many hats. She was the first black faculty member of Jacksonville University. She taught for 49 years, and 30 of those at JU. My dad's first campaign manager, as I understood it, and was there making lunch for Martin Luther King and Reverend Abernathy and Andy Young as they all met with my father at my parents' house to organize the St. Augustine marches.
And you were there as a little boy, I guess.
Well, I was not. I was. I'm just young enough to have missed that event.
Yeah.
That was 1963. I was born in '65, but my older sister, Robin, has memories of it, vivid memories of that time. It was very
Difficult
very,
time.
very difficult, very exciting time. I think that my parents were involved at a level of the civil rights effort that they had a palpable understanding that they were making a tremendous difference at the time. And so, you know, when I talk about the work my dad did, and he was about MLK's age, born about the same time, you know, most of his civil rights work through his effort at one of the first work-related female cases, Ida Phillips versus Martin Marietta, that was argued at the Supreme Court in 1970. Most all of the work he did was in his 30s. So it was a young movement.
And so we have civil rights plus all the governmental problems of Jacksonville in the decade of the 60s. It was a heck of a period of time, huh?
You know, not many of us were here when Channel 4 did its expose, government by gaslight, which really focused on the level of corruption, which was extraordinary. I mean, 11 elected officials being indicted on over 140 counts of bribery and fraud and such, and that was just a piece of what was happening. The governments, the county and city governments, had no requirement to communicate with one another, much less plan together. And so you see a duplication of government almost in every aspect, whether it's recreational department, whether it's the tax collector's office, whether it was the city or county auditor.
Police and fire and libraries.
Well,
Yeah.
each had its own,
Yeah.
and so we've gone from a situation where folks literally didn't know who to call, whether it was the sheriff's office, the county sheriff's office, or the city police department. Didn't know whether it was a fire, city fire, or county fire, to having one of the best first responder systems in the country. For example,